She crashed into his life, literally, and when he saw her face, he realized she looked eerily like the woman he thought he'd already buried. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing Fair Hill in a quiet, white hush. Luke Carter kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other gripping a travel mug of lukewarm coffee as his pickup rumbled down the winding back road. Rosie, bundled up in a pink coat and purple earmuffs, hummed softly in the back seat, her boots swinging just above the floor. School had been canceled due to the storm, and Luke was headed to the shop anyway. Old Mr. Halberd's truck wouldn't fix itself, and bills didn't wait for clear skies. As he rounded the curve near Hollow Creek Bridge, his headlights caught a flash of silver, skewed, half buried in a snowbank. Instinct kicked in before thought. He hit the brakes. The truck skidded slightly on the icy patch, tires crunching over the snow as he came to a stop a few yards ahead. He threw it into park, muttering a quick, "Stay put, baby," to Rosie as he opened the door and stepped out into the freezing air. The coupe's front end was smashed in, steam hissing from beneath the crumpled hood. One headlight flickered weakly, like it hadn't quite given up. He approached fast, boots sinking in the snow. The driver's side door was ajar, and slumped behind the wheel was a woman, head tilted, blood trickling down her temple, eyes fluttering open just as he reached her. Hey, can you hear me?" Luke's voice was low but urgent. He knelt beside her, gently pressing 2 fingers to her pulse, steady, cold, but alive. Her lips parted. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Back road near Hollow Creek. You crashed. Can you move?" She winced as she nodded. "I think so." Luke helped her out of the wreck carefully, his jacket already off and around her shoulders. Up close, her face caught in the glow of his headlights. Something inside him froze. He knew that face. Not exactly, but something about her eyes, green and wide, dug into him like a memory too raw to name. From the truck, Rosie called out, "Daddy, is she okay?" Luke swallowed hard, eyes still locked on the woman's. "I hope so," he said. But something in him already knew. This moment wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. Luke sat on the edge of the hospital chair, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced tight like they were holding something back. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, mixing uneasily with the hum of machines and the quiet beeping that marked time in heartbeats. Through the narrow window, the snowfall hadn't let up. The town outside was frozen, but in here, everything felt like it was on fire. His chest, his thoughts, his past. He'd called in a favor to get her seen quickly. The ER nurse had asked him if he was family. He didn't know how to answer, not yet. The woman lay on the hospital bed, still unconscious, her head wrapped with a bandage where the gash had bled down into her collar. Her cheeks were pale against the harsh white of the pillow, but it wasn't the injury that had Luke frozen in place. It was her face. It wasn't exact, nothing ever was, but the shape of her mouth, the angle of her jaw, the faint arch in her brow. It was Clara. Not a twin, not a perfect copy, but close enough that his hands had started trembling the moment he got her out of the car. Now, in the calm of this room, without snow and panic clouding his mind, the resemblance became almost unbearable. He hadn't seen Clara's face in nearly 4 years, but it never left him. It was in every memory of their tiny wedding, in the corners of Rosie's smile, in the dreams he didn't talk about. And now it was lying right here, alive, breathing, bruised but real. Luke rubbed a hand over his jaw, trying to shake the chill crawling down his back. He didn't believe in ghosts, but this was something else. The woman stirred. Her lips moved faintly. A whisper carried more in breath than sound. "Clara?" He leaned forward, heart racing. She blinked slowly, her eyes a vivid green beneath heavy lids. "No," she murmured. "I'm Ivy." Luke sat back, the name ringing through him like a bell dropped in still water. Clara's sister. The one no one had seen in decades. the one Clara never spoke of again. The heater in the pickup struggled against the cold, spitting out bursts of lukewarm air as Rosie huddled beneath her puffy coat, knees drawn to her chest. She pressed her mittened hands against the window, fogging the glass with each breath. Outside, her father stood beside the woman from the wreck, his tall frame crouched low, jacket draped around her like a blanket. The snow kept falling, quiet and soft, covering the world like a secret. Rosie didn't say anything at first. She just watched. Her dad had helped strangers before. He was that kind of person. But this time, something felt different. The way he moved, the way he looked at the woman. There was a stillness about him, like he wasn't sure if he was seeing a dream or a memory. Rosie didn't know how to name that feeling, but she felt it. The woman's face was clearer now in the glow of the truck's headlights. Even from the back seat, Rosie could see the way her hair fell, loose and dark, just like Mommy's had. The curve of her nose, the shape of her lips. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "Daddy," she said softly, almost too quiet to hear herself. Luke didn't turn. He was focused on helping the woman sit on the edge of the truck bed, speaking gently, asking questions Rosie couldn't make out. Rosie pressed her face to the cold window, voice a little louder now. "Daddy, is that Mommy?" Luke's head jerked up, eyes wide. He stepped toward the truck, his face unreadable in the half-light. He opened the passenger door and climbed in, shaking the snow off his shoulders. "No, baby," he said, voice low, careful. "That's not Mommy." Rosie didn't look convinced. Her eyes were still locked on the woman outside, now sipping water from a paper cup, her hands trembling a little. "But she looks like her," Rosie whispered. "She looks like Mommy." Luke looked away, jaw tight. "I know," he said after a moment. "I know she does." And for the first time in years, he didn't know how to explain what that meant. The fluorescent lights in the ER cast a pale sheen over everything, making even the warmest skin tones look washed and ghost-like. Luke sat by the window, his arms crossed, his foot tapping restlessly against the tile floor. Nurses came and went, voices hushed, but every time someone opened the door to her room, his eyes snapped up, waiting, hoping for clarity, for answers, for something that would make this surreal day make sense. The doctor had told him she'd been stabilized. No internal bleeding, no broken bones, just a nasty concussion, some bruised ribs, and a stitched gash across her forehead. Physically, she was okay. But the moment she opened her eyes, that would be the real test. Luke wasn't sure what he feared more, that she'd wake up and confirm she was just a stranger, or that she'd somehow confirm what he hadn't dared to believe. The curtain rustled. He stood. The nurse gave a small nod. "She's coming around." Luke stepped into the room slowly, cautiously, as if the air itself might shatter if he moved too fast. The woman stirred beneath the hospital blanket, her brow furrowing slightly, then relaxing again as her lips parted on a slow breath. Her eyelids fluttered. One hand moved, faint and trembling, searching the space beside her like someone reaching in the dark. Luke moved closer, the soft shuffle of his boots the only sound. Then, barely louder than a whisper, the woman's voice broke the silence. "Ivy." The name hung in the air like a fragile thread, delicate and final. Her eyes remained closed, her face tight with some distant pain, but that one word, one syllable, landed hard in Luke's chest. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Ivy. A name from another lifetime, a name Clara had only spoken once, in a moment of sadness she never fully explained. A name buried in journals, scribbled in the corners of old photographs, folded into the cracks of a life that ended too soon. Luke stepped back, his heart thudding. This woman wasn't a ghost. She was real, and she was Clara's sister. The house was quiet when Luke returned home, the kind of stillness that felt heavier than silence. Rosie had fallen asleep in the truck, her cheek pressed against the seatbelt strap, so he'd carried her inside, tucked her under the knitted quilt on the couch, and made sure the fire in the wood stove didn't go out. Outside, the snow hadn't slowed. Inside, his mind wouldn't stop racing. He wandered to the mantel without meaning to, drawn there like something in him already knew what he needed to see. The framed photos stood like small memorials, moments frozen in time. Rosie's kindergarten smile, Clara holding her in the hospital, their wedding day under that crooked elm tree. His eyes scanned each one until he found it, the one Clara never talked about but refused to throw away. Two teenage girls sat side by side on the hood of a rusted old car, legs swinging, hair wild in the wind. Clara had been 17 then, her smile open, unguarded. Beside her was a girl with the same green eyes, the same stubborn chin, though her smile was smaller, almost hesitant. Luke picked up the frame, running a thumb along the edge of the glass. "Ivy Bennett," he murmured, as if saying the name would summon something. He hadn't thought about that photo in years. Clara had only mentioned Ivy once, maybe twice, and always in a voice that closed doors rather than opened them. "We lost touch," she'd said. "Long time ago. It's complicated." Luke had respected the distance. Everyone has pieces of their past they'd rather leave buried. But now, staring at the bruised face of a woman in a hospital bed who looked like Clara's reflection in water, he realized just how much he hadn't known. About Ivy, about Clara, about the way one decision could ripple across time and crash into a snowbank outside Fairhill. He set the photo down slowly, the glass catching the firelight. It wasn't a ghost that showed up on that road. It was a chapter he'd never been allowed to read, until now. The morning light seeped through the blinds in narrow slats, painting golden stripes across the hospital room wall. Ivy sat upright in the adjustable bed, propped by a few stiff pillows, a thin blanket pulled to her waist. The swelling on her cheek had gone down some, her voice had returned, quiet but steady. Luke brought her coffee from the vending machine. She thanked him with a small nod. "Right, Giamamum," her fingers curling tightly around the warm paper cup. They hadn't spoken much since she woke, just a few practical exchanges, shallow questions with shallow answers, but now, seated beside her in the cramped room, Luke couldn't hold it in any longer. "How did you know, Clara?" Ivy blinked, then looked away, the muscles in her jaw tightening. Her thumb ran over the coffee lid as if she needed something to do with her hands. "She was my sister," she said softly. "My real sister. We were born 2 years apart, same dad, same mom, but they split us up." Luke frowned. "Split you up?" "Our mom wasn't stable. She gave me up when I was 8. Ivy's voice didn't waver, but something behind it cracked a little. "Clara stayed. I didn't. I was passed from house to house, school to school. But I never stopped writing her. I didn't know where she was for a while, but once I found her again, I sent letters, birthday cards, everything." Luke leaned forward, brows drawn tight. She never mentioned that, not once. Ivy let out a bitter breath. "That's the thing. I thought she didn't want me anymore. I thought she got the letters and just didn't answer. After a few years, I stopped sending them, figured I was part of the life she left behind." "She kept a picture of you," Luke said quietly. "It was always on the mantel." Ivy's lips parted, her eyes glinting with something between surprise and grief. "She did?" "She never threw it away, never talked about it either." Ivy stared down at her coffee, her throat working against something unspoken. "I wanted to find her," she said. "I really did." Luke looked at her carefully. "She wanted that too," he said, even if she never said it. Luke hadn't meant to go through her things. Ivy was still asleep, her breathing slow and even beneath the soft hum of hospital machinery. He'd stopped by early with a change of clothes borrowed from the lost and found at the garage, just to make sure she had something other than a hospital gown waiting. But when he reached for her coat, folded neatly over the chair, something shifted inside the worn canvas bag beside it. A box, small and beaten up, nudged into view. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed. Luke paused, guilt already bubbling in his chest. But then he saw the corner of an envelope, yellowed with age. Clara's name scribbled across the front in looping ink. He sat down slowly and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, some still sealed, others tattered from being handled too many times. All addressed the same way. Clara Bennett. No stamps, no postmarks, no signs they'd ever been sent. One by one, Luke picked them up. The paper smelled faintly of old perfume and dried ink. Some were dated, 2003, 2008, 2011. The handwriting changed over time from shaky and wide-eyed to sharp and clean. Some had hearts drawn in the corners. Others looked like they'd been written in anger, words underlined 2 or 3 times in messy blue pen. He unfolded one at random. Dear Clara, I saw a girl today who looked like you. She was getting ice cream with her mom, and I wondered if you remembered when we used to do that. I don't know if this letter will find you, but I hope you're okay. I hope someone is being kind to you. Love, Ivy. Luke's throat tightened. Another letter was just 1 sentence long. Why didn't you write me back? He closed the box gently and set it on the bedside table. There were too many letters to read all at once, and frankly, he wasn't sure he could handle what they'd say. But he knew what they meant. Ivy had never stopped reaching out, even when no one reached back. And Clara had never seen any of them. The wind had eased by the time Luke pulled the truck off the main road and down the gravel path that led to the cottage. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the sun had made a weak appearance, casting long shadows through the bare trees. Ivy sat in the passenger seat, bundled in one of Clara's old jackets from the back of the closet, faded denim lined with sherpa, still carrying the faint scent of cedar and something floral. She hadn't spoken much since leaving the hospital, just watched the world pass by with quiet eyes that didn't miss much. Luke had offered to drop her at a motel. She said nothing. Then, after a long pause, he'd said, "There's a place, out near Mill Creek. No one's used it in years." And still she hadn't answered, just nodded. The cottage stood like a memory that hadn't quite faded, its roof sloped with age, the front steps sagging a little at the corners. Ivy climbed out slowly, boots crunching through the snow. Luke unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside it smelled of old wood and dust, the kind that lingered no matter how many windows you opened. A thin beam of sunlight streamed across the hardwood floor, lighting up the floating motes in the air like suspended snowflakes. The furniture was still there, weathered armchairs, a patchwork quilt over the back of the sofa, a crooked bookshelf that Clara used to rest her tea on instead of books. Ivy stepped inside, her breath catching just slightly. She ran a hand over the mantel above the cold fireplace, her fingers brushing past a candle stub and a dried wildflower in a cracked vase. "This was hers?" she asked. Luke nodded. It was their family's. Clara used to come out here when she needed quiet. She said it was the only place the noise couldn't find her. Ivy didn't smile, but something in her posture softened. "I'll take care of it," she said, "just for a little while." Luke hesitated, then replied, "Take as long as you need." And for the first time since that snow-covered road, Ivy let herself exhale. Rosie leaned against the kitchen table, her cheek resting on one arm as she poked at her cereal with the other. The spoon made soft clinks against the bowl, but she wasn't really eating. Luke moved around the kitchen quietly, rinsing mugs, frying eggs, pretending not to notice the way her eyes kept flicking toward the window. Outside, the snow was melting in slow patches. The road had cleared enough that Ivy had walked to the shop that morning, wrapped in that oversized denim jacket Clara used to love. She hadn't said much when she left, just a small wave to Rosie and a murmured promise to be back for dinner. But that was enough to stir something in Rosie's chest, something she didn't quite have words for yet. "Daddy?" Her voice was small. Luke dried his hands on a dish towel. "Yeah, Bug?" Rosie sat up, frowning thoughtfully. "Why didn't we know Aunt Ivy before?" He paused. "That's complicated." But she's Mommy's sister, right? Rosie tilted her head. Was she mad at us? No, baby, he said gently, crouching beside her. She wasn't mad. Grown-ups sometimes get lost from each other, and it can take a long time to find your way back. Rosie was quiet, chewing on her lip the way she did when something didn't feel fair. Is she staying forever? Luke exhaled slowly. I don't know. That's up to her. Rosie frowned deeper, clearly unsatisfied. Then, after a long pause, she looked down at her spoon. Do you think she could sing the lullaby Mom used to? The one with the stars and the boat? Luke's chest tightened. That song hadn't been heard in this house in years. Clara had made it up. Half melody, half whispered magic, and Rosie used to beg for it every night. I don't know if she knows it, he said quietly, but maybe we could teach her. Rosie's eyes lit up just a little. Okay. Luke smoothed her hair back gently. She's not replacing Mom, you know, but maybe she's someone new we can love. Rosie nodded, more serious than 6 should ever have to be. I think Mom would like that, she said. The night settled in slow and quiet, the kind of hush that only small towns know. A single porch light flickered above the cottage door, casting soft shadows across the snow-dusted steps. Ivy sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a thick quilt, her knees drawn to her chest, the old chains creaking gently beneath her. The stars hung heavy overhead, sharp, bright, and too honest. Luke had stayed late at the garage, closing up after a long day. When he pulled up to the cottage, he spotted her silhouette through the windshield, motionless in the dark, like she was trying not to exist. He climbed the steps without a word and sat beside her, leaving a sliver of space between them. The swing shifted slightly under the added weight, but Ivy didn't look over. I couldn't sleep, she said quietly. Luke nodded. Didn't think you would. They sat in silence, the kind that doesn't press too hard. The wind had calmed, just a whisper through the trees, and the snow had turned to icy crust where the sun had melted it earlier. Finally, Ivy spoke, her voice barely louder than the creak of the swing. I left home the day I turned 17. Luke didn't move. He waited. I had a backpack, $40, and a spiral notebook with Clara's address scrawled on the inside cover. She didn't even know I was coming. Ivy let out a bitter breath. I took the bus all the way to Hollow Bend. I was going to surprise her. Thought maybe, if I just showed up, we could start over. Luke turned to look at her, but she kept her eyes forward, fixed on the night. But she wasn't there. She'd moved away a few months earlier, left no forwarding address. No one knew where she'd gone. It felt like the universe had shut the door on me, right as I finally reached it. She paused, swallowing hard. I never tried again. I told myself it was my fault, that I waited too long. Luke's voice was low. You didn't. Ivy finally turned to him, tears clinging to her lashes. I wanted to come back, she said, but I didn't know if anyone would still want me. By the end of the week, Fair Hill was humming, not with snowblowers or engine noise, but with whispers. Low, drawn-out murmurs passed between neighbors like folded notes in church pews. At the diner, forks paused midair. At the grocery store, glances lingered too long in the canned soup aisle. And at the school pickup line, no one said it out loud, but everyone noticed the woman with Clara's eyes buckling Rosie into the truck with careful hands. Is that Clara's sister? Someone asked in line at Henson's Hardware, voice pitched just low enough to still feel safe. I thought she didn't have one, came the reply. She's been staying at the old Bennett cottage. With Luke? Well, not with him. The town didn't mean to gossip, not exactly, but Fair Hill was small, and small towns kept memories like heirlooms, handled gently but never thrown away. Clara Carter had been one of their own. Everyone remembered her smile, the way she organized the fall fair like it was a royal parade, the way she carried Rosie on her hip like she was made of sunlight. Her death had shaken something deep. And now, years later, a woman shows up from nowhere, same eyes, same cheekbones, same lilt in her voice, and starts walking around like she belongs. Clara's ghost, they whispered, at the bean shack, where Ivy had picked up coffee twice in 1 week. It's uncanny. Luke's got a type, someone muttered at the barber shop, more bitter than amused. He's grieving, still is, the older crowd defended. You don't tell a man how to carry that kind of loss. But curiosity always walks faster than compassion. People started watching Luke more closely. When he filled gas at the station, when he laughed with Rosie on the sidewalk, when he stood in line behind Ivy at the bakery, and didn't say a word. No one confronted him, not yet. But the questions hung in the air like snow-heavy clouds. What's he thinking? Who is she really? And what if she stays? Luke felt it too, that weight of eyes, but he'd lived in Fairhill long enough to know something else. Eventually, they'd stop whispering, or they'd whisper louder. The knock on the garage door was hard enough to shake the front window pane. Luke looked up from under the hood of a rusted Dodge, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he stepped toward the front. He knew that knock, hadn't heard it in years, but he hadn't forgotten it. Standing there in a long black coat, collar turned against the wind, was Grant Bennett, Clara's older brother. Same sharp jaw, same deep-set glare that always made people stand up a little straighter. He'd come straight from the city by the look of it. Shiny shoes, dusted with slush, gloves tucked neatly under one arm, a scowl he hadn't earned yet pressed tight across his face. "Grant," Luke said, keeping his voice even, "didn't expect you." Grant didn't waste time. "Where is she?" Luke blinked. "Who?" "You know who. The woman pretending to be Ivy." He took a step inside, eyes sweeping over the grease-streaked walls like they offended him. "I saw the picture you posted. Rosie holding her hand like she's family." "She is family," Luke said, jaw tightening. Grant gave a dry laugh. "Clara never mentioned a twin, never once in all the years I knew her." "She wasn't a twin," Luke corrected. "She was younger, estranged. There's a difference." Grant crossed his arms. "And you just believe that? No questions asked?" Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. The letters, the DNA results, the photo on the mantel, he'd seen enough to quiet every doubt that mattered. But Grant wasn't done. "You think this woman shows up out of nowhere, just happens to crash into your life, looking like Clara, and that's all coincidence? You've got a daughter to think about, Luke, a town watching. You really want to let some stranger rewrite the story Clara left behind?" Luke stepped forward, eyes level. "You haven't been here. You weren't here when Clara died. You weren't here for Rosie's nightmares or her birthday parties. Don't show up now trying to tell me who's allowed to matter." Grant's jaw worked, but no words came. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Just be careful," he said quietly. "People lie, even the ones who look like ghosts." And then he was gone, leaving only cold air and questions Luke thought he'd already answered. The test kit sat unopened on the kitchen table, its sterile packaging oddly out of place among the chipped mugs and half-eaten toast. Luke stared at it like it might explode. Ivy stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Outside, the wind carried the sounds of melting snow dripping from the roof, each drop landing with a rhythm that only made the silence between them feel louder. "I'm not doing this to prove anything to you," Ivy said finally, her voice low but steady. "I'm doing it because I need to know." Luke didn't respond right away. He shifted in his chair, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together like he was trying to hold himself together from the inside out. "I believe you," he said. "I know," she replied, "but you're still hesitating." He looked up at her. "Because what if it says something different? What if it tells me I've been wrong this whole time?" Ivy's expression softened. Not pity, not anger, just a quiet kind of sadness. "Then at least we'll know. We can stop guessing, stop dancing around it." Luke picked up the box, turning it over in his hands. He'd never cared for things like this. Science packaged in plastic, answers delivered by barcode. But Ivy was right. The town was whispering, Grant was circling, and deep down even Luke had questions he didn't want to name out loud. He nodded once and stood, the legs of his chair scraping softly across the floor. "Okay." The test was simple. A swab of the cheek, 2 samples. One from Ivy, one from Clara's old hairbrush, still in the drawer after all these years, still holding a few long strands like time had left them there on purpose. When he dropped the envelope in the mailbox that afternoon, Luke didn't feel relief. He felt like he'd just let go of something sacred, fragile, and impossibly heavy. Back at the cottage, Ivy waited on the porch. When she saw him, she didn't ask if it was done. She just whispered, "Thank you," and turned back toward the fading sun. The results came in a plain white envelope, no bigger than a birthday card. Luke held it in one hand, thumb pressed against the flap, the other gripping the railing of the cottage porch like it might steady him. Ivy stood just inside the door, her breath fogging the glass, eyes locked on the envelope like it might breathe fire or vanish into smoke. He didn't open it right away. For days the town had buzzed louder. Grant's visit had poured gasoline on gossip, and suddenly the whole of Fairhill seemed to believe it had the right to know who Ivy really was. Some people had been kind, cautiously friendly. Others had kept their distance, too polite to accuse her out loud, but sharp enough with their silence. Now the answer was inside a single sheet of paper. Luke finally peeled it open and unfolded the document. His eyes scanned the lines, heart pounding, like it was trying to outrun the truth. And there it was, simple, clinical, absolute. Biological relationship, full sibling match. He exhaled, a breath that felt like it had been waiting years to be released. Ivy stepped onto the porch, watching him carefully. "You're her sister," he said softly, holding out the page. Ivy took it, her hands shaking just slightly. She read the words 3 times before she spoke. "So I'm not crazy." "No," Luke said. "You're home." The next day, word spread like wildfire. It always did. Fairhill didn't have much in the way of secrets, and someone at the post office knew someone at the clinic who had a cousin who overheard Luke say, "Confirmed." That was all it took. Suddenly, people who had avoided eye contact were offering hesitant smiles. A few stopped Ivy on the sidewalk, hands in their pockets, apologies tangled in their throats. "I'm sorry," they'd say. "We just didn't know." Ivy never got angry. She just nodded, accepting the weight of every regret with the same grace she carried since day one. And for the first time since Clara's funeral, Fairhill began to remember how to open its arms again. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting amber shadows across the cottage walls. Ivy sat curled in the old armchair near the window, a faded quilt draped across her knees. On her lap sat a worn shoebox she hadn't touched since she arrived. Until now. Luke was in the kitchen washing dishes, Rosie already asleep upstairs. The house felt quiet, not the kind of quiet that came with loneliness, but the kind that waited for something to be said. "I found something," Ivy said softly, not looking up. Luke dried his hands and walked over, sitting on the edge of the sofa. "What is it?" She opened the box slowly, lifting out a stack of brittle envelopes tied with a frayed blue ribbon. The paper was thin, some corners yellowed and curling. She handed him one. The return address was scribbled in a looping script. A women's home, a facility miles from where she and Clara had grown up. The letter inside was dated months before Ivy was born. "She gave me up before anyone even knew I existed," Ivy said, her voice thin. "Not just gave me up, hid me. Clara didn't know. My father didn't know. I was never supposed to be part of the story." Luke read the first few lines, then folded the paper carefully. "Why?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Ivy's gaze didn't leave the fire. "Shame. Our mom was 17 when she had Clara. No husband, no money. When she got pregnant again, it was too much. Another child out of wedlock would have ruined her completely in her family's eyes. So she gave me away to a private agency, told everyone she lost the baby." "Ta-da!" Luke leaned back, stunned by the weight of it. Clara never mentioned. "She couldn't. She didn't know." Ivy's voice cracked. "And I never told her. I wanted to, but how do you say, well, hey, I'm the piece of your childhood someone erased?" Luke didn't answer. He reached out and took one of the letters, holding it like something sacred. "She should have known," he said. Ivy nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yeah, but now someone finally does." And for the first time, her story wasn't hidden anymore. The bell above the garage door jingled as Ivy stepped inside, her boots leaving faint tracks across the dusty concrete. The smell hit her immediately: motor oil, steel, and that faint burn of something recently welded. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Luke looked up from under the hood of an old Ford, sweat beading at his brow despite the cold outside. "You're early," he said, eyebrows raised. "I brought donuts," she replied, holding up the box like a peace offering. "Figured that's the traditional bribe for convincing a mechanic to teach you how to use a wrench." Luke chuckled. "Coffee would have sealed the deal, too." "Next time," she grinned, already rolling up her sleeves, "I want to help." He hesitated. "You sure about that? Cleaning carburetors and sorting spark plugs isn't exactly glamorous." Ivy looked around the garage, grease-streaked walls, scattered tools, a half-built engine block on a stand in the corner, and something about it all felt honest. Raw, no masks, no curated perfection. "I don't need glamorous," she said. "I need useful." Luke nodded once, then gestured toward the back shelf. "All right, rag bins over there. Start with the tool trays. They're a mess." And just like that, she began. At first it was awkward. Ivy moved carefully, like she was afraid of touching the wrong thing or breaking some unspoken rule. But Luke watched her with quiet patience, correcting gently when she reached for the wrong socket or confused a wrench for a ratchet. By noon, her hands were smudged with grease, and her ponytail had slipped loose. But there was a lightness in her eyes Luke hadn't seen before. She wiped her hands on her jeans and laughed when a bolt rolled off the counter and disappeared under a cabinet. "This place is chaos," she said, breathless. "It's organized chaos," Luke corrected. She smirked. "You sure about that?" "No," he admitted, handing her a ratchet. "But it's mine, and now I guess it's a little bit yours, too." And in that oil-stained corner of Fairhill, Ivy began to feel like she wasn't just cleaning a garage. She was rebuilding something that had been broken far too long. The day snuck up on them, quiet and unannounced. February 17th, Clara's birthday. No one spoke of it at breakfast. Luke moved through his morning routine with a heaviness in his chest, the date circling his thoughts like a quiet echo. Rosie asked for syrup on her toast, but didn't smile. And Ivy? She watched both of them with eyes that already knew. By early afternoon, the shop closed early. Luke didn't explain why. He just flipped the sign and walked home in silence, Rosie's small hand wrapped in his. When they reached the house, something was different. The dining room table had been cleared, not just cleaned, cleared. No receipts, no tools, no Rosie's scattered crayons. Just a white linen cloth, a small vase of dried lavender in the center, and 3 plates set quietly in a triangle. Ivy was in the kitchen, pulling something from the oven, her sleeves rolled high and hair tied back. She didn't look up when Luke walked in, just said softly, "She liked apple pie, right? With cinnamon and a bit of lemon?" Luke paused in the doorway. "Yeah, that's exactly how she made it." Rosie peeked in. "What's going on?" Ivy turned and smiled gently. "We're remembering her today, not with tears, just with dinner and pie." That night they didn't dress up. They didn't light sparklers or sing songs, but the candles flickered as the snow fell quietly outside, and a warmth settled over the room that hadn't been there in years. They shared Clara stories, Luke talking about how she used to sing to the radio off-key on long drives, Rosie recalling the time she let her wear her wedding veil while vacuuming. Ivy listened more than she spoke. When the pie was served, no one said a word. They just ate, slow and careful, as if each bite carried a memory. Later, Luke stepped out to the porch alone for a moment, eyes on the stars. "I didn't know I needed that," he murmured. Behind him, Ivy stood in the doorway, arms crossed for warmth. "Neither did I." It wasn't a birthday celebration. It was a quiet promise she would never be forgotten. The night was soft and still, the kind that wrapped itself around the house like a thick quilt. Upstairs, Rosie was nestled under her favorite blanket, the one with the faded stars and loose stitching at the corners. The overhead light was off, but her small bedside lamp cast a warm pool of light across the room, turning her walls into a storybook glow. Ivy sat beside her on the edge of the bed, thumbing through the last few pages of The Secret Garden, her voice calm and even, the way Clara used to read, never rushing, never skipping. Rosie listened with her eyes half-lidded, her fingers curled under her cheek, soaking in every word like it mattered more than anything else in the world. Luke stood in the hallway just outside the door, arms crossed as he leaned against the frame, listening. He didn't make a sound. He didn't want to break the moment. As Ivy closed the book and set it gently on the nightstand, Rosie blinked slowly and whispered, "Can we read the next one tomorrow?" Ivy smiled. "Of course." There was a long pause. Rosie reached out and tugged gently at the sleeve of Ivy's sweater. "Thanks, Aunt Ivy." The words landed so softly, Ivy almost missed them. But Luke didn't. His chest tightened as he watched from the doorway, waiting for the correction that never came. Ivy froze for just a breath, her eyes flickering with something unreadable, surprise, warmth, maybe even a hint of grief. But then she leaned down, brushed a strand of hair from Rosie's forehead and whispered, "You're welcome, sweetheart." Rosie turned over, sleep tugging her away. Ivy stood slowly, catching Luke's eyes as she stepped into the hallway. He didn't say a word, just nodded once. "Did Clara ever talk about me when Rosie was born?" she asked quietly. Luke looked down the hallway toward the room still lit with golden lamplight. "She always said Rosie would be lucky if she had someone who reminded her how strong girls could be." He paused, then added, "I think you just became that someone." And Ivy didn't try to stop the tears this time. It was late afternoon when Luke finally opened the trunk at the foot of his bed. He hadn't touched it in years, not since Clara died. The wood creaked as he lifted the lid, releasing the scent of old paper and lavender sachets, long faded. Inside were remnants of a life half-lived. Clara's scarves, her favorite worn hoodie, photo albums thick with Polaroids, and tucked near the bottom, her journals. He hadn't meant to go digging, but Ivy's presence had stirred things up in more ways than one. A part of him needed to know what Clara had left behind, not just for him, but for her sister. He took the journals to the kitchen table and leafed through them, one by one. Most of it was familiar: grocery lists in the margins, baby updates after Rosie was born, musings about garden plans, fears about the future. But in the third notebook, nestled between a recipe for peach cobbler and a sketch of the porch layout she never got to finish, was a folded page, torn on one edge, handwriting sharper than usual. He unfolded it carefully. "Dear Ivy, I don't know if this will ever reach you. I don't even know where you are, but I've been thinking about you a lot. I don't know why Mom did what she did. I don't understand how we were made to grow up like strangers, but I've started asking questions. I've started digging. Luke doesn't know, not yet. I haven't told him how much I miss someone I never got to really know. I wonder if you're okay, if you're loved, if you ever think of me too. I don't know how to start a letter like this. Maybe I just did. Clara." Luke sat there for a long time, staring at her handwriting, letting her voice fill the quiet room. The letter wasn't finished. No envelope, no date. Just a start, one she never got to complete. He pressed the page flat, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. Later that night, he handed the letter to Ivy without a word. She read it once, then again, then folded it slowly as if it were made of something sacred. "She was looking for me," she whispered. Luke nodded. She never stopped. The call came on a Thursday just after lunch. Ivy was wiping her hands on a towel at the garage, having just managed her first successful oil change without Luke needing to step in. Her phone buzzed in her back pocket, and she almost didn't answer until she saw the name. Marla Redford. A name from a past life, from a world of sharp suits, polished meetings, and never-ending deadlines. She stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Still alive out there?" Marla teased, her voice rich and confident. "Barely," Ivy laughed, trying to keep her voice light. "What's going on?" "I heard through the grapevine you've resurfaced. Small town, big whispers. Had to call." A pause, then, "Also, I have an offer." Ivy leaned against the porch post, her breath visible in the cold. What kind of offer? A real one? Head of outreach for a new agency, good salary, benefits. Your name on the door, eventually. You'd have to come back to the city, of course, but you wouldn't be starting over. You'd be walking in with respect already in place. Ivy's fingers tightened around the phone. Marla continued, softer now. "Look, I know why you left, and I'm not pretending this fixes any of that, but you were good, Ivy, and you deserve something more than some dusty shop in a town full of people asking who you are." Ivy didn't answer. Her eyes drifted across the snowy yard to the window where Rosie sat drawing with markers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Inside, Luke laughed at something, the sound faint through the glass, but unmistakably warm. "I'll send you the details," Marla added. "Just think about it." They hung up. That evening, Ivy didn't mention the call. She smiled through dinner, helped Rosie rinse dishes, even laughed when Luke teased her about still confusing a torque wrench with a tire iron. But when the house went quiet, she stood in the hallway with the offer pulled up on her phone, glowing like a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open again. She could disappear, this time on purpose. The garage was quiet, the kind of late-night hush that made every sound sharper. Ivy stood by the workbench, wiping her hands with a rag more out of habit than need. Luke was across the room, sorting bolts into an old coffee can, but his movements were stiff, tense. "I got the offer," Ivy said finally, her voice cutting through the silence. Luke didn't look up. "I figured." She waited, but nothing more came. "Aren't you going to ask what I'm going to do?" He dropped a bolt with a sharp clang. "Do I get a vote?" That caught her. She turned to face him fully, eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," he said, finally meeting her gaze, "you've got one foot out the door and another in this house. You help Rosie with homework, you clean up at the shop, you plan birthday dinners like you've always belonged here, but now you get one phone call and you're already gone." "I haven't gone anywhere," Ivy snapped. "I've been here. I've tried to help. I've tried to be whatever this town would let me be, whatever you would let me be." Luke stepped closer, voice low. "And what is that, Ivy? Clara's sister? Her shadow? The woman who's trying to rewrite a past that doesn't belong to her?" The words hit harder than either of them expected. Ivy's jaw clenched. "You think I'm replacing her?" "I don't know what to think," he shouted, louder than he meant to. "I look at you, and I see her. I hear Rosie laugh, and I see the way you smile, and it scares the hell out of me, because I don't know if I'm grieving or moving on, and I don't know what that says about me." Silence followed, thick and raw. Then Ivy, softer now. "Maybe it says you're human, and maybe it says we're both still figuring out how to miss the same person without losing ourselves." Luke turned away, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't want to lose her memory," he murmured. Ivy nodded. "Neither do I." But between memory and healing, something had to give. The fever came fast. One minute, Rosie was coloring on the living room floor, laughing at Ivy's terrible knock-knock jokes. The next, she was curled up on the couch, flushed and shivering, her forehead burning beneath Ivy's hand. Luke rushed in from the garage the moment he heard Ivy call. She didn't yell, just his name, once, with a tone that sliced through the walls. He was at Rosie's side in seconds, pressing a cool cloth to her head, his pulse thudding in his ears. "She said her tummy hurt," Ivy whispered, kneeling beside them. Then she got quiet. Luke looked at her, saw the fear behind her calm. It matched his own. They moved together without words, Luke gathering medicine, Ivy drawing a lukewarm bath to cool Rosie down. She held the child's hand while Luke read the thermometer. When Rosie started to cry, it was Ivy who rocked her gently, whispering lullabies half remembered from childhood. Midnight came, then 2. Luke drifted in and out on the couch, boots still on, jacket across his chest, but Ivy never left Rosie's room. She sat by the bed, wiping her brow, reading softly from Clara's old fairy tale book. When Rosie finally dozed off, cheeks less red, breaths deeper, Ivy stayed right where she was, just watching, just protecting. Luke stood in the doorway and watched her too. Not just as Clara's sister, not as the woman who crashed into their lives and stirred up all the buried things, but as someone who belonged. He saw the way Ivy brushed Rosie's hair back from her face, the way her eyes flickered to the window at every gust of wind, the way her own fear didn't stop her from being steady. Something shifted in Luke then, quiet and powerful, because for the first time since Clara's death, he saw it. Someone sitting in that chair beside Rosie, not out of obligation or accident, but love. And it wasn't a replacement. It was something new, something whole. Snow tapped gently against the windows, falling in a lazy hush that softened the whole world outside. The garage had closed early, the roads too slick for business. Inside the cottage, a small fire crackled in the hearth and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon, left over from the tea Ivy had brewed when Luke showed up, soaked and cold, claiming his truck wouldn't start. They sat at the kitchen table, facing each other with mugs in hand, the silence between them comfortable now, earned. Rosie had fallen asleep early after a day spent building pillow forts and sipping ginger ale. Ivy had tucked her in with practiced ease, like it was second nature. Luke glanced at her over the rim of his mug. "Thanks for staying last night. I don't think she would have let me leave the room if it wasn't for you." Ivy gave a quiet smile. "She needed someone who wasn't afraid, and I needed to feel like I could be that person." "You were," he said softly. The words lingered in the air, heavy but kind. Ivy looked down at her coffee, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek. "I didn't mean to stay this long," she admitted. "Didn't plan to get this involved." Luke leaned back in his chair, eyes steady on her. "Would it have been easier if you hadn't?" "Maybe," she said, "but easier doesn't always mean better." Something passed between them then, unspoken but undeniable. Not a fix, not a filling of empty space, just two people quietly realizing the ground beneath them had changed. Luke stood slowly and crossed to her side of the table, hesitating only a second. Ivy looked up, her breath catching ever so slightly, and then, carefully, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't urgent or desperate, it was gentle, real. A pause in time where grief and memory and hope all collided and softened into something that didn't need words. When they parted, Ivy didn't move away. She just whispered, "That shouldn't have happened." Luke's hand stayed at her cheek. "No," he said, "but I'm glad it did." The next morning was quiet, but not the kind of comforting quiet they'd been building. This one had sharp edges, like walking through a room that used to feel like home, but suddenly didn't know where to put its furniture. Luke was up early, already gone to the shop before Ivy came downstairs. No note, just an empty coffee pot and a silence that echoed louder than any slammed door. She stood in the kitchen, fingers resting on the edge of the sink, staring out the window at the snow-covered yard. Rosie's boots were still by the door, the memory of last night, warm firelight, shared laughter, the kiss, played in her head like a loop she couldn't turn off. It had been real, she knew that, but now it felt like something had cracked beneath it. At the garage, Luke buried himself in work. Didn't take a lunch break. Didn't answer when Jack from the feed store made a joke about him glowing like a teenager. He just tightened bolts and avoided mirrors, because the truth was, he didn't know what he'd done. He'd kissed Clara's sister, and it hadn't felt wrong. That was the problem. Later that afternoon, Ivy showed up at the garage, her coat zipped to her chin, hands deep in her pockets. She didn't step inside, just waited by the door until Luke noticed. He wiped his hands and came out slowly, eyes wary. "We should talk," she said. He nodded. "Yeah." They stood by the side of the building, the cold biting through their clothes, but neither of them noticing. "I didn't plan that," Ivy said, her voice low. "And I don't regret it, but it feels like betrayal," Luke finished. She nodded. To her, to the memory of her. Luke looked down at the snow between their boots. "I keep wondering what she'd think, what she'd say." "Me too." They didn't say more than that, didn't need to. The ache was mutual, and as Ivy turned to go, Luke didn't stop her, because neither of them knew if what they were feeling was love or just a desperate way of holding on. The cemetery was still under a thin blanket of snow, the kind that muffled footsteps and made the whole place feel like it had paused mid-breath. Luke parked at the edge of the gravel drive and stepped out slowly, his boots crunching softly as he made his way to the far corner beneath the tall elm where Clara had always said the wind sounded gentler. Ivy stood a few steps behind, watching from a respectful distance. She hadn't followed him out of obligation. She'd followed because she knew today was something he needed to do alone, even if he didn't want to be alone while doing it. Luke stopped in front of the grave. The headstone was simple. Clara May Carter, beloved wife, fierce mother, 1984 to 2020. Someone, maybe Ivy, had placed fresh wildflowers in a glass jar at the base. The frost had started to gather on the petals. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, breath clouding in the air. Then, finally, his voice broke through the silence. "I didn't think it would ever get easier," he said softly. "And maybe it hasn't. I've just gotten better at pretending I'm okay." He exhaled, his shoulders heavy. "I didn't know how to raise Rosie without you. I didn't know how to keep going without falling apart. I kept the garage open because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I didn't talk about you because I didn't know how to without breaking." His eyes stayed on the stone, but his voice steadied. And then Ivy showed up. And everything I'd kept buried came rushing back. I hated her for it. Hated that she looked like you, that she smiled like you, that she reminded me of everything I lost. But she's not you. A pause. "She's not you, and I'm tired of holding that against her." Behind him, Ivy's breath hitched, but she didn't move. Luke wiped his eyes and knelt, brushing a bit of snow from the base of the stone. "I miss you, Clara, but I need to stop blaming the world for surviving you." And in that cold, quiet corner of Fair Hill, he finally let himself say goodbye. The drawer had always stuck a little, one of the old nightstand's quirks, jammed just enough to be annoying, never quite bad enough to fix. Ivy tugged at it absently while tidying Clara's old room in the cottage, not expecting anything more than a spare sock or a lost pen. But this time, with a creak and a sudden shift, the back panel gave way. Something slid forward from the shadows. A small envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed but never mailed. Ivy picked it up carefully, her name written in Clara's handwriting across the front. Ivy. Her heart thudded as she sat down on the edge of the bed, fingers trembling. She turned the envelope over once, twice, then opened it with the gentleness of someone holding a fragile piece of time. Inside was a single sheet of paper, faded ink folded neatly. The handwriting was familiar, looping and imperfect, with a few cross-outs like Clara had been searching for the right words. "If Ivy ever finds you, tell her I never stopped hoping. Tell her I looked, not as hard as I should have, but I never stopped wondering where she was, if she was safe, if she still laughed the way I remembered. I didn't tell Luke about you because I didn't know how, and I didn't tell Rosie because I was afraid it would sound like a story without an ending. I didn't want to hand her another question I couldn't answer, but if she's with you, if she finds you somehow, please tell her she was never forgotten, not even once. Clara." The letter fell into Ivy's lap as she pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes brimming. She read it again and again, each word like a balm and a blade. Later, she walked into the living room where Luke sat reading, Rosie drawing on the floor beside him. Ivy didn't say anything. She just handed him the letter. Luke read it in silence, his expression unreadable until the very end. Then he looked up at her, voice barely more than a whisper. "She did want you." Ivy nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "She always did." The city offer sat unopened in Ivy's inbox, glowing from her phone screen like a quiet dare. A generous salary. Her own team. A corner office in a glass building that overlooked a skyline she used to dream about. The kind of offer people didn't get twice. She stared at it from the porch swing as the late afternoon sun stretched shadows across the yard. Luke was inside fixing dinner. Rosie's laughter spilled out of the kitchen as she practiced spelling words out loud, asking Ivy for help through the open window. Ivy looked at the screen once more, then finally locked the phone and set it beside her. When Luke joined her later, wiping his hands on a towel, he didn't ask about the offer. He just sat beside her, the swing creaking beneath their weight. The air between them was warm, familiar. "I got the final paperwork today," she said quietly. He nodded. "I figured. They want an answer by tomorrow." Still, he said nothing. "I'm not going," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I thought I might. I even told myself it made sense. Clean start, smart move, safe distance from everything." Luke turned to look at her, his brow tense, waiting. "But then Rosie handed me her drawing this morning," Ivy continued, "and it was me, her and you, under a crooked little house with smoke coming out of the chimney. And above it she wrote, 'Our family.'" Luke exhaled slowly, something loosening in his chest. Ivy smiled, a sad, knowing kind of smile. "I've spent my whole life running from ghosts, from silence, from stories I didn't think I belonged in." She turned toward him fully. "I don't want to run anymore. I'd rather build something here, even if it's messy, even if it hurts sometimes." Luke reached for her hand, resting it gently in his. "This place doesn't need perfect," he said. "It just needs real." Ivy nodded, her eyes bright. "Then I'm right where I'm supposed to be." The moonlight spilled softly through Rosie's bedroom window, painting the room in silver and shadows. Ivy sat at the edge of the bed, brushing tangles from Rosie's hair with slow, gentle strokes. The little girl was quiet tonight, quieter than usual, her eyes distant, fingers picking at the hem of her pajama sleeve. "Can I tell you something?" Rosie whispered. Ivy paused, setting the brush down. "Of course!" Rosie sat up a little, clutching her favorite stuffed bear to her chest. "I had a dream last night, about Mommy." Ivy's breath caught. She leaned in gently, heart already twisting. What kind of dream? Rosie's voice was soft, like she didn't want to scare the memory away. "We were in the backyard, and Mommy was sitting on the swing. She looked like she used to, in that blue dress she wore to the fair. She smiled at me and patted the spot next to her." Ivy nodded, her own eyes misting. "I sat down," Rosie continued, "and I told her I missed her. I asked if she was mad that we laugh now, that we have new dinners, that we bake things she didn't teach me." She hesitated, her voice trembling, and she said no. She said she loves when we laugh. She said she's glad I still eat too many cookies. Ivy let out a quiet laugh, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Then she looked at me," Rosie whispered, eyes wide, and she said, "It's okay if you're happy again. That's what I want." The room was silent for a beat, just the ticking of the old wall clock and the soft breath between them. Ivy wrapped her arms around Rosie and pulled her close. "That's a beautiful dream, sweetheart." Rosie snuggled into her chest, already drifting. "Do you think dreams are real?" she asked sleepily. Ivy kissed the top of her head, her voice thick. "I think the really important ones are." And as Rosie slipped into sleep, Ivy sat there in the quiet, holding Clara's daughter close, heart full of something deeper than grief, permission, peace, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning. The sky was the soft gray of early spring, the kind that hinted at warmth but still held the bite of winter in the breeze. Luke stood at the edge of the yard, hands in his pockets, watching Rosie race up and down the gravel driveway with chalk-streaked hands and a grin too wide to contain. Ivy sat on the porch steps, laughing, a smudge of pink across her cheek where Rosie had tagged her mid-drawing. It was nothing special. No grand moment, no dramatic music, just an afternoon. But something in Luke shifted. For months, he'd moved through life like someone walking underwater, everything muffled, everything heavy. Clara's memory had been like a weight around his ankle, something sacred he couldn't release without feeling like he was betraying her. And when Ivy came crashing back into his world, it had stirred everything up. All the guilt, the grief, the impossible ache of wanting something again. But standing there now, watching Ivy wipe her hands on her jeans and call out a joke to Rosie, Luke didn't see Clara's shadow. He didn't see a ghost or a stand-in or a question he still couldn't answer. He saw her. Ivy, the woman who showed up in a snowstorm, half-broken and wholehearted. The woman who stayed through the stares, the whispers, the doubt. Who didn't try to fill Clara's shoes, only made room for her own. She hadn't tried to fix him. She just stayed. Luke walked back to the porch, steps quiet, hands still tucked deep in his coat pockets. Ivy looked up as he approached, brushing hair from her face, a hint of a question in her eyes. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, then crouched beside her, knees bent, eyes steady on hers. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and realize none of this was real," he said. "That this, us, is just something I made up because I missed her so much." Ivy held his gaze. "And now?" He smiled, small and certain. "Now I think I finally stopped running." He took her hand, and for the first time he wasn't looking backward. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long golden streaks across the porch where Ivy sat curled in a sweater 2 sizes too big, one of Luke's old flannel ones she'd stolen weeks ago and never given back. Her bare feet were tucked beneath her, and in her hands was a simple white mug, one Rosie had painted at school, slightly crooked, rim-chipped, but still usable. She tilted it, sipping slowly, then paused. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed something new printed along the bottom edge in Luke's neat handwriting. "This is home now." She blinked, smile creeping in before she could stop it. Just then, the screen door creaked open, and Luke stepped out, holding his own mug, matching in color, but clean and unmarked. "Took you long enough to notice," he said, leaning against the post, the breeze teasing a few strands of his hair. "You wrote on my mug," Ivy said. "I did." "No speech, no candlelight, no question with a question mark?" Luke chuckled. "I figured we've already answered all the hard ones." Ivy turned the mug in her hands again, tracing the letters with her thumb. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't a proposal. But it was something better, steady, real, rooted. She looked up at him, warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. "I'll drink to that," she whispered. Luke walked over, sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. No rings exchanged, no big declarations. Just 2 people, worn by the world, quietly agreeing to stop wandering. Rosie's giggles floated through the window behind them as she sorted puzzle pieces at the kitchen table. Inside was still messy. Life would still be complicated. But this was simple. They raised their mugs together in quiet ceremony. No vows, no promises carved in stone, just 2 words spoken with more meaning than most could carry. Home now? The sign went up on a crisp Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the air smelled like sawdust and something new beginning. Luke stood at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, a wrench still in one hand from adjusting the alignment rack earlier. Ivy stood beside him, hair pulled into a messy bun, paint flecks on her jeans from touching up the front door. Rosie danced around them both, her boots thudding against the gravel as she tried to catch falling leaves like they were confetti. The wooden sign was handmade, carved by one of the town's old craftsmen, who barely said 3 words but had a gift for shaping things that lasted. It was bold but not flashy, elegant but simple, just like the people it represented. Carter and Bennett Auto. Beneath it, smaller words burned into the wood, fueled by grit, held by grace. Luke swallowed hard, his throat tight. Ivy ran her fingers gently over the grain, her name alongside his for the first time in something permanent, not just paperwork, not just whispers and maybes, something real, public. Rosie looked up at them, her eyes wide. "Does this mean it's ours now?" she asked. Luke smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It means we're building it together." The news spread quickly, as everything did in Fairhill. Customers started showing up just to take pictures of the new sign. A few left cards tucked in the mailbox, some congratulating them, others just scribbled with "about time." One woman left a note Ivy would keep folded in her wallet for years. She'd be proud, not because you replaced her, but because you honored her by choosing joy anyway. That night, Luke locked up the shop, and Ivy flicked off the lights. They stood under the glow of the sign, hands intertwined. They weren't just fixing cars anymore, they were mending the past, one turn of the wrench at a time. And Fairhill? Fairhill finally stopped whispering. It started waving. The classroom was warm and buzzing with soft chatter as the 4th-grade students passed their handwritten essays to the front. Mrs. Langston smiled kindly as she stacked the papers, promising to read each one over the weekend. But Rosie Carter didn't look nervous like some of the other kids. She sat at her desk with her chin high and her hands folded, like someone who knew exactly what her words meant, even if no one else could yet. The assignment had been simple: write about a miracle. Some kids wrote about pets they weren't supposed to have lived, or a baseball game where they hit a lucky home run. But Rosie's paper began with a memory. It started with snow, a car crash, and a stranger who looked a lot like someone we thought we'd lost. She didn't fill the page with big words. She didn't try to explain the science of DNA tests or the silence between grown-ups when grief sits heavy. She just told the truth as she'd always known it. My aunt got lost, my dad got stuck, but love fixed everything. Rosie wrote about how her mom had died when she was little and how, for a long time, her dad didn't laugh much. How she used to draw pictures of her family with one missing piece she could never quite name. Until the day a woman with tired eyes and a broken car showed up, and that picture finally made sense. She looked like Mommy, but she wasn't. She was someone new, someone who stayed. She described Ivy's pie, her laugh. The way she read stories with voices and never skipped the long ones. How the garage got a new sign and their house felt warmer even in winter. How her dad finally started dancing in the kitchen again. And at the very end, Rosie wrote, "Some miracles don't happen in the sky or with magic. Some just walk through the snow when you least expect it. Some bring pie. Some bring peace." When Mrs. Langston read it, she cried. And years later, so would everyone else who heard the story of how Rosie's family was built. Not from perfection, but from pieces that refused to stay broken.